Hi, this is Paul. Yesterday, I did a video on Kanye, and in that video, I just sort of dropped in the middle this comment from Sam from the Discord server. Sam has his own channel. Sam is our resident a Christian, sort of evangelicalist Christian, but non-Trinitarian, and so we've had Sam's been a very interesting person in our community. Sam's also really sharp and watches things carefully and knows a ton of church history. That's why I don't debate him on some of this stuff, because he's read far more than I have. And he sort of made an offhand comment about Brett Weinstein's moral matrix, which rang a bell in my head. And so often with these monologue videos, I know for Jordan Peterson, a lot of what he did, felt like thinking out loud, and to the degree that it wasn't, I can't really tell you. I'm not saying he was insincere. It's just sort of his style, according to some people who are closer to him and know him well that I've spoken with. These videos for me are really thinking out loud. And so when Sam said that in the Discord server, it really rang a bell. And so I've been chewing on it, and actually saw Sam wrote a little bit on it this morning on the Discord server again. Where does this come down to? Well, Brett Weinstein talks about evolution as a genocidal spelling bee, where it's not even just because each of us doesn't just have one genetic code. Well, we sort of do, but there are all these other little elements competing within the genetic code in sort of a fractal way. And that's a really clever, whatever critique I give to Brett and Eric Weinstein, these dudes are scary smart. You can't sit and listen to these guys and not just realize that they are, flat out geniuses. Now, being a flat out genius doesn't mean you get everything right. In fact, the smarter you are, the more you see, hopefully the more you realize how much you're not seeing, and the more open you are to learning. Now, not every genius is that way, but I've been impressed with these two in terms of their capacity for conversation with people different from themselves. And so his take on evolution as a genocidal spelling bee is really clever. But then in his conversation with Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan about his metaphorical truth, he talks about this repugnant morality. And this triggers this ongoing atheist Christian debate about morality. Atheists can't ground their morality. And we're going to get into that a little bit. Now, I do read my comments, and a number of you have said I'm unfair to Sam Harris with respect to this. Maybe I am. I don't know. I'm not trying to be unfair to Sam Harris, but I'm listening very carefully, especially to Sam's interchanges with Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson, because there are significant hours of conversation between Jordan and Sam and Brett and Sam, and they all seem to be friends. And so I don't think they're trying to straw man each other. And I think Brett's conversation with Sam Harris on Brett's podcast was particularly enlightening, that Brett can't seem to see through this, what I see as a inconsistency in Sam's position between the manifest image and the scientific image. I think, as C.S. Lewis says of many of C.S. Lewis's contemporaries, Brett just kind of BS's his way through. And maybe I'm not seeing it. Maybe I haven't read enough of him. Maybe I haven't heard enough of him. But he hasn't seemed to have been able to convince Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein that there's a massive inconsistency in his system. And Jordan and Brett are both smarter than I am. They both have read more of his, have listened to him carefully, are his friends, are not being unbiased, are very much not trying to straw man him, but they can't seem to figure out the logic that Sam Harris brings to his system. So, yeah, maybe I'm being unfair. I don't know, but based on both Brett and Jordan trying to get to the bottom of Sam's way of getting around the fact-value distinction, the fact-value, problem that materialism has, I think I'm sort of with Team Brett and Team Jordan on this, that I don't think Sam has this figured out. Anyway, that gets into the question without a God. Well, why would a God change? Why would a God afford a certain level of morality? Because on one hand, a God is outside the system, and get into my conversation with Brett Sockold. A God is outside the system in terms of theism, and the God also is within the manifest image, operates fully in terms of normativity, the God picks and chooses and decides what's right, what's wrong, what he prefers, what he doesn't prefer, is a judge, yada, yada, yada. And that just lights up an entire moral system. And so theism and morality go hand in hand, even polytheisms and morality. But the morality might be pegged on the particular divinities, the particular competing divinities for a grander, larger moral system. And that's where the meta-divine realm, Christine Hayes, Ezekiel Kaufman, that's where all that stuff comes into play, because in a sense, as I've said earlier, my God number one, God number two, these are sort of boxes on my philosophical, theological workbench. And I throw a lot of things into them. So God number one is less personal. God number two is definitely personal. God number one is built into the fabric of the world. God number two is transcendent and stands apart from the world, immanent, transcendent. And lately, in terms of Vervaeke's agent-arena relationship, God number one is the agentic aspect of God, or the arenic aspect of God. Part of my problem is I always misspeak. So the arenic aspect of God is God as arena. God number two is the agentic aspect of God in terms of the Hebraic Christian formulation of who and what God is. And the difficulty that you have if you only have an arena is that morality for the agents is pegged, especially in Sam Harris's view, to the well-being of that moral agent. In other words, what is moral is what is to pursue your own agenda as an agent. Notice the words coming together. Agents have agendas. Agentic, agent, agenda. These things are all lining up. And, this stuff is built into language. And so what is the basis for any morality where success is the outcome of adaptation? And this really begins to align well with Jordan Peterson's Darwinian truth, where morality and truth sort of come together. So part of the problem with morality and individual agents and competing agents, now remember these agents, us as individuals, we pile up and create principalities, communities, and so then you have the agency of the community and the morality of the community, and basically morality becomes that which is best adaptive for the success or the well-being or the welfare of that community in competition with other communities. So this is sort of where I bump into Brett on one hand saying, it's successful, but it's repugnant morally. So his morality is sort of off-site or offshore of the success. And so then, where does Gnosticism come into this? Well, Sam, and Gnosticism is more of a family of beliefs, and there are lots of different families out there, but common is often the assertion that that the world is, and this is very polytheistic again, the world is created by competing different gods. And so if you look around and you notice we're living in the age of decay, decay is all around us, people die, people break down, things aren't stable. Well, maybe the world was created by a demiurge that was a dumber, more foolish copy. You know, Manichaean ideas get into some of this. It's a very strong dualism, and where, you know, the world was made by a stupider God, but there's a better, more moral God that is a higher God, and so you need to transcend. You need to transcend your physicality and get up out of it. Now, Brett Weinstein is a materialist or a naturalist, and so there's no second level to transcend up into like the Greeks had, or like Gnosticism had, but he sort of continues to appeal to it, and again, this is where he sort of, this is the Christian tell in this, or again, John Vervaeke wrote, you know, Platonism. What do they teach these days? I mean, come on, Brett, read a little Plato. You want some Platonism to afford you morality, but you deny its ontology. So that's sort of where the Gnosticism. And again, I'm more than open to a reformulation. I'm not looking to strawman Brett here, but just to point out an aspect of his metaphorical truth moral argument that he made with Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson. Now, this brings us to Daniel Bonavac and his take on Wilfrid Sellers and the manifest versus scientific image. And that's a powerful take. And again, I got this via Dr. Jim. That's a powerful take where Wilfrid Sellers notes that the thing that the scientific image doesn't afford is normativity. And there's no room for normativity in the scientific image. Should the speed of light be higher or lower than it is? Should big G gravity be higher or lower than it is? Should, you know, and you'd say, well, it should if you want to. Well, that's right. It's telic. It seeks an end. It seeks a telos. So if you're going to afford human life in the shape that we have, then these big constants should be finely tuned just right to afford these things. But there's nothing in science that said it should be this and not that. It should be this and not that. Is only living in a world where there is telos, where things are pursuing some other outcome or agency. And this is where you get the fact-value distinction. And this is really the hard problem. You can't get to an ought from it is. And this is really the hard problem for materialists. Because, well, you know, you can't say in a sense that human beings as we know them today ought not to go extinct by virtue of, pick your poison, nuclear annihilation, global climate change, you know, maybe some supernova too close to us, you know, whatever. Human beings should not go extinct. There's no place for that in the scientific vision, just as, you know, Tyrannosaurus Rex shouldn't have gone extinct. You know, that shouldn't is built within a whole system of things. And that's where you have your fact-value distinction. Now, I played a little clip 2 videos ago from, Jordan has them A-B in terms of Vancouver 2. I usually call it Vancouver 1, Vancouver 2. Because the conversations where the conversations where Douglas Murray was sort of in between, they went sort of in different directions. And I think Brett was a really good conversation partner for this certain realm of things that they're dealing with. And so they had the first conversation in Vancouver and then the second. And of course, it's sort of like with football or basketball at halftime, the coach goes in and, you know, reassesses and you're going to come out and you're going to change your game. And so in Vancouver 2, Jordan really starts going after Sam in terms of his well-being. The first one, he's really making the argument about this a priori structure. And the second one, he really goes after him in terms of well-being. And he says, okay, and Sam has this riff about as bad as possible, take away all meaning. But again, even how Sam is setting it up, he's He's giving away the show in some ways. I didn't want to talk too much about Sam in this one, but you argue that hell is bad and heaven is good. Okay, but so is hell bad if you imagine hell to be a fireplace of white hot thing? Well, hell isn't bad if you're running a blast furnace and you're trying to create steel. What you've done is you've smuggled in preference, telos, and consciousness into the system. Things that are not in the scientific vision, because again, as Jordan Peterson lays out in the transliminal videos before his rise to fame, and if you haven't watched those transliminal videos, some of those interviews with another Jordan, they're some of the best interviews that Jordan had done, and they happened right before, obviously, his wave, carried him into new places. But you're smuggling in all sorts of things. And so in that, Jordan Peterson lays out his Darwinian truth and lays out the fact that part of the way that the scientific image gets so powerful is it covers one eye. So you take out consciousness and you take out telos and you just try to see things for what they are, and you try and reduce the variables and get down to discrete processes, so on and so forth. Now, this is where well-being becomes tremendously problematic, because you have consciousness and you have preference and you have telos and you have meaning. You have all of that in the system, and that's where, just look at Buddhism and, well, what is suffering is created basically by attachment to things. And now, again, I really like John Vervaeke's treatment of Buddhism in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And I, in the Discord server today, some people were talking, and I know this has been an ongoing problem. To get into Vervaeke, you have 50 hours of Meaning Crisis videos to watch, and not everybody can do that. And even just going through them once is difficult. So I do recommend Andrew Sweeney's blog on Medium, where he distills Awakening from the Meaning Crisis into a smaller thing. Part of the difficulty, and there is a good Discord server that's dedicated to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I think that the difficulty that many on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server have is that John's work can get really esoteric sometimes, because John is developing a new vocabulary. And the thing is, if you want to make progress, you need to develop a new vocabulary. The difficulty is that if you want to use that new vocabulary, you have to learn that new vocabulary and live into the new vocabulary. And if you've ever learned a second language as an adult, you begin to realize that your biggest impediment to learning the second language is your first language. And so, maybe I should do and my adaptation of John's, as Job calls them, fancy Vervaeke words, is probably bent and corrupted by my own usages of it. And so, it's interesting whenever John Vervaeke and Jonathan Peugeot talk, when I talk with the only time I talked with the three of them, I went into that conversation with a conscious goal of trying to interpret them for a broader audience, because the conversation before, when they talked, they both just got increasingly esoteric, and it's like, oh boy, you got the Eastern Orthodox and the Neoplatonist, and off they go up into the heavenlies. So anyway, so Jordan Peterson in Biblical Series 1, with respect to this meaning crisis, he notes that, okay, we watch each other and we act it out, and archetypes are drama plus representation. And these, again, you get back into the sacrifice, and the culture net stream and the genetic stream get intermingled with human beings very quickly, because all of this manifest image stuff begins to shape the genetic code. But now genetics for human beings work very, 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 very slowly. And CultureNet is enormously fast and enormously powerful. And, Yuval Harari talks about this in his books in terms of, the fiction. So he talks about the CultureNet stuff as a fiction. Now I talk about the CultureNet stuff as religion W. And I know sometimes I've said L and I'm misspeaking, but I don't know why I would say L. But religion W, that's worldview religion. So that's And that moves intensely fast, and it's enormously powerful, and it very quickly colonizes the genetic realm. And so when Jordan Peterson, really in Biblical Series 1, which is the most watched, and I think actually the best of the series, lays out what religion is for him, and it's religion W. And so basically, and this is why Jordan Peterson, I think, is so important, because he like Tom Holland is, he's got the skin knees in the dark cave as he's feeling his way through it. And so now we have to talk about evolving morality and religion W, which is religion worldview, and religion S, which is religion from the secular point of view. It's all about the should. Okay, what is should? It's this for that. So right away we're getting into agency. So creatures that are operating in the realm of should need to be agents, because I should do this and not this, which means I could do this and not that. And so when you listen to Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris go at it, this is where Brett just keeps hammering him. And no, Sam keeps saying, no, you don't understand. Yeah, it's quite clear. A whole bunch of us don't understand, Sam. The easiest way to understand a should is to have a telos. I should take I-5 and the Altamont if I want to know the way to San Jose, okay, from Sacramento. So I go down the 5, I go over the Altamont, and then, that's one way. Or I could go down 80 and do 680, but then I got to go through Oakland and all the East Bay stuff, and that traffic gets really crazy. And since the traffic in the Valley is less bad than the traffic in the East Bay, do I know the way to San Jose? Yes. I take 5 and I go over the Altamont and I weave my way through. And then if I want to go to Santa Cruz, I go up over the mountain and I get to beautiful Santa Cruz, where my son is going to school. So that's how you should go. There's a way you should get through a cornfield. All of this should is part of the manifest image. And how should we live? That's not a scientific question. That's a manifest image question. Hell, should you avoid hell? Well, if you're not, making chromium steel, yes, because flesh burns in fire, or the worm does not consume, etc., etc. Heaven to achieve. And so there's the telos. It's hell to avoid and heaven to achieve. And of course, this is deeply built into Western Christianity for a very, very long time. And someone brought up because I brought up in my video about primogeniture. And primogeniture is the preference of the firstborn in terms of the inheritance, because I told the story of the prodigal son. And so the firstborn, a man has 2 sons, the firstborn and the secondborn. The firstborn will get a double portion of the inheritance, and the secondborn will get, basically what's left over. And if you have more children, the firstborn still gets a double portion. And someone mentions quite rightly, well, and let's do a Brett Weinstein move here and talk about, well, how would primogeniture develop? Well, it's not very hard to imagine. Primogeniture developed as a way to avoid splitting up farms or estates into unproductive tiny portions. If you had too many sons, well, in some ways, the oldest son is the longest living image of the father. And so the oldest son is the imprint of the father. And there's lots of layers to this. And of course, sometimes sons die. And so you take the oldest son, but the oldest son is always the longest living image of the father. That's what an oldest son is, by definition. The younger sons haven't lived as long as the oldest son. And if the father is still alive, the oldest son has more experience with the father. Now, sometimes in families, the older son maybe is alienated and exiled, and primogeniture might be broken, and he might give the inheritance to someone else, yada, yada, yada. All these things happen. But primogeniture makes sense. Let's say it has a historical, sociological evolution in that sense, not genetic evolution, but culture net evolution, has an evolutionary basis, because if you look at competing groups and one group is practicing primogeniture and the other group is not practicing primogeniture, and the farms are getting split up into smaller and smaller portions so that the civilization as a whole is not flourishing as well as the other civilization in their competition, the civilization that practices primogeniture will outcompete the civilization that is not practicing primogeniture. And the idea is that not only are we as human beings have morality. See, now morality is a very interesting thing because it's public, because people who are moral, we shoot up the hierarchy and we elevate them, and people who are immoral, we take them down the hierarchy, and that's how status works. And now we're back into Jordan Peterson lobster land, because this is built into our system, says Jordan, all the way back before we could see trees, he says to Susan Blackmore. Bucko needs a little bit of air, but I'm not going to blow him up right now. So this gets built into us, and it gets built into us as peoples. You know, Israel is called Israel, named after Jacob, who is renamed Israel, and so Israel is Jacob, and this is, again, symbolically, this is how it works. So the civilization that practices primogeniture is outcompeting the civilization that isn't practicing primogeniture, because, and we can look at one factor involved in it, and there may be more, just as, again, the oldest son is the time in which the son will have the greatest imprint of the father. So if the father has been very successful in managing the estate, the oldest son will have had more time than any of the other sons to watch and manage the estate. And so the oldest son is the biggest imprint of the father. All right. So there's another reason. So one of it might be the size of the inheritance lots. Another one might be the amount of time that the second son has, or the first son has been imprinted unconsciously, subconsciously by the father, and has learned from all the father's mistakes. And so you have all of this local knowledge that gets built into the oldest son that the other sons have not yet had time to imbibe. Now there might be another son below who is more intelligent than the other son, or for one reason or another, maybe the father was a bad businessman and the other son is learning from an uncle or a neighbor and he does better. And so, all of this over long periods of time works out. But basically the idea is that elements within religion W get imprinted into religion S, and the values get perpetuated, and they come into societies, and individuals get leveled up into societies, and some outcompete the other. And so the idea that Jordan has, and which Sam recognizes the validity of, is that religion W gets encoded into religion S, and this then has wisdom that gets passed on to others, and human beings compete with this. So a value and a practice develops. People who practice it thrive. Those who don't struggle. It becomes a value and is encoded into the religion S systems. It's already present in the religion W systems. Those are much more implicit. And the value is of survival and competition against the others. And so again, primogeniture, morality is a behavioral value that moves an individual or a community towards a desirable or good goal. Communities that practice it thrive, communities that don't dwindle, and this gets into all of our little status hierarchies. And so, this is getting played out in Christian churches right now with respect to Donald Trump, because back when Bill Clinton was doing his things with Monica Lewinsky, Christians all over the place were saying, you won't be blessed by that. They're making a religious moral case that sexual morality gets practiced. And then into the religious system, this gets encoded into, well, if you're poor morally, then you'll have hurricanes and earthquakes and all of that. And so you can see how these ideas level up into the kinds of behaviors that eventually were deeply critiqued by the Enlightenment. Okay? So the idea was that if the president, as the figurehead, is not morally is immoral, then God, the consciousness, will judge the nation based on the immorality. And you can find this in the Bible. So David, of course, sees Bathsheba bathing. I'm getting more and more Bible stories into my little videos, aren't I? David sees Bathsheba bathing and says, she's a hottie. And Uriah, and David is, if you read the story, David is now sending his armies out, and he's becoming a fat and lazy king, is increasingly corrupt. And so while Uriah the Hittite, who is one of David's mighty men, who is this basically this mercenary private army that David uses to take over the kingdom and saves him from Absalom eventually, but Uriah the Hittite is out fighting David's battles, and Dave was at home, and he's kind of bored at home. He looks out his window, and there's Bathsheba bathing herself. Well, why is she bathing herself? Well, she probably is cleansing herself after she's had her period. And see, this is a subtext because she's going to get pregnant. We're actually, in this story, we're tracking, they have ideas about the fertility cycle. They're not dumb. And so she's bathing. Well, what's that mean? Well, she's cleansing herself after her period. And he looks down and wouldn't mind me some of that. And so sends a servant, says, Bathsheba, come on up. And now it's a Me Too moment because Bathsheba really can't say no. You have a status differential. You have a power differential, as we like to say. So Bathsheba comes and David lays with her. And king really shouldn't do that. So let's just keep it on the down low. And then, again, I'm preaching on commit adultery this week, so these things work in my head. So keep it on the down low. But then Bathsheba comes back and says, I'm pregnant. No abortion. So what to do? So, David tries to figure out, I need a cover story. So, send word and have Uriah come back for a little bit of R&R, a little bit of leave. Have him be the messenger. So send him back and tell me how things are going from the front. Okay, so he comes back, gives a report on how things are going in the front. Great, Uriah. You're my guy. You're a great soldier. You deserve some R&R. Go home and sleep with that hot wife of yours. You probably didn't say hot wife. That would have been, go home and, take a little break. You ran all the way from the front. So, but Uriah, unlike David, who is fat and happy sleeping with his neighbor's wife, Uriah sleeps outside his door. Well, why would you sleep on? What are you, homeless? No, he sleeps outside his door because he's making a statement of solidarity with his troops that are out at the front fighting. And meanwhile, David is sleeping in a palace. Now, this is a problem for David because sleeping at the door, Uriah is making the statement, I'm not taking advantage of my legitimate claims to sleep with my wife. So, then David thinks, oh, crap, this is a problem. So what to do? So Uriah, come on over. We're going to have a little feast, and I'll get him drunk. And he's going to look at his hot wife and that doesn't work. So David says, all right, calls his general over and says, I'm sending Uriah back to the front. When you're taking that city, send him to the place the fighting is the fiercest. Now, he's a tough dude, but he can still do it. Send him to the place where the fighting is fiercest, and when it gets really fierce, have his buddies pull back. So David uses his kingly power to not only to kill this most faithful servant, but to undermine the bonds between the soldiers and the loyalty that David himself is depending on. And this is where you see David's corruption and how corruption undermines the people who need the structures in order to maintain the hierarchy. All right, king, you're the king. And they do it, and Uriah dies. And Too bad what happened to Uriah. He was such a faithful servant. I should really do something for his widow. It's so upsetting, and she's so hot. Bathsheba, you come and live with me. You're pregnant? I was just consoling you, and if you understand Levirate, no, we'll have a baby, and we'll call him Uriah. Of course, all of this is going on under the surface. And then the Lord goes to Nathan the prophet. What of the prophet? The prophet sees insider information, goes to Nathan the prophet. They go to David, tell him a story. Wealthy man had herds and flocks, had a neighbor, one little sheep. Family loved it, slept with their children, was a pet. Someone comes to the house of the wealthy man, and he doesn't want to dip into his store of herds and flocks, and so takes his neighbor's sheep, his servants, takes his neighbor's sheep and cuts it up for his guest, make him look good. David, what should be done with that wealthy man who did that? David gets on his moral high horse. That man should die. Nathan, you are that man. The child's going to die. The child's going to die. Your son, David, is going to die because of your corruption. Well, if you understand how corruption works, the son is going to die for the whole nation. Because if David doesn't deal with this corruption, if David's corruption continues, it is going to undermine the kingdom, because David's already undermined his own kingdom because his general and the soldiers around Uriah, they know the deed that's been done. And that spreads. And David's kingly authority is based on the idea that he is loyal to his servants as they are loyal to him. It's reciprocal. And so you see, these moral systems build up, and they come out of behavior, and they have reason behind them. And you can see how and Jordan Peterson talks about this in his series, having a God that is above the system. And that's why in Christianity, the king himself is not God. There's always a God above the king. There's always someone critiquing the king. There's always something outside the moral system, and that is a hedge on corruption. And that's built into the thinking. Now, here's the difficulty. If you don't have God number two, if you take God number two out of it, you say, oh, well, and in some ways, the American system does this. No one is above the law. Where was I? I was just talking to a homeless dude. He says, I do drug and alcohol counseling every day. And nobody does it better than me because he's not sober either. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yeah. So Jordan Peterson notes that in Christianity, it's above the system. And then he has these conversations with Sam about, well, is there a difference now we're looking at competing cultures or competing groups. And of course, these competitions, they fractal. They go all the way down and they go all the way up. Is there a difference between groups of people that believe in God number two? And so they're expecting crime and punishment. They're expecting punishment and reward. All of this stuff is built in, and like all of these things come because one of the things is that if it's God number one and God number two, your whole system is lit up. All of your relational abilities, all of your narrative abilities, all of those things. And so a group that believes in God number one and God number two, they're whole in. Because as Jordan Peterson has with his future authoring program, they're both running towards a goal and they're running away from something they're looking to avoid. And so it's very powerful. You can understand that scientifically. It's very powerful sociologically, psychologically. Morality is this enormous thing. And part of what we've been seeing in our culture is with the rise of woke religion, it's purely moralistic. I mean, the moralism is just all over the place. And now part of what happens with human beings is that we find moralists annoying. And so, for example, in the 1970s and 80s, part of the complaint about Christianity was and even during the Cold War, so the cultural alignment and Christian traditional morality were quite a bit in alignment, and so Christians were considered sort of prigs and prudes and moralists, and they were annoying because they're always nagging about the morality. And now, as Christianity has sort of lost status in the culture, now new moralists are in their place, and the more moralistic they get about things, the more people get annoyed. And that's sort of a natural check on moralism in the culture. Self-righteousness, and again, this is all from Christianity built in, self-righteousness undercuts morality because basically corruption gets exposed. And so this was a factor when Christianity was quite dominant, and now as sort of woke moralisms get really shrill and moralistic, people get increasingly turned off. And this is where I'm not saying that some of the woke stuff isn't dangerous for the culture, but I think it's too incoherent. I don't think it will last. I don't think it'll be very stable. And again, if you want one of the best treatments of that, look at Jonathan Peugeot's parasitic storytelling video, because I thought that was just a genius video, and he laid it out all right there. So morality is a behavioral value that moves an individual or community towards a desirable goal, and usually towards outcompeting their neighbors, and it gets encoded into the religion, and there's a God above, and so here you can tell a story, you can tell a secular story about how religion develops, and some of that is behind Jordan Peterson's work. Now Brett wants to talk about the bitter pill, and fair enough. It's a good point. It might be that the context changes, so primogeniture is really a powerful thing when most of your inheritance is farmland. And as farm plots get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and some of this is built into the Israelite system where you have the inheritance, and the inheritances stay within the family, but now you've got more and more sons. And so, in a sense, that the system of primogeniture starts to break down actually as you flourish. In other words, it's a really helpful system if you don't have too many sons, or the sons aren't living, et cetera, et cetera. But if in fact you're flourishing, the system starts to undercut itself. And we see this all the time in many, many ways, that some values and some practices have real good values for certain, in car engines, certain the power, sort of the power curve. Like with a gasoline engine, there's always sort of the hesitation when you put your foot on the gas that you don't have with an electric car. And then especially if you have a turbocharger, you rev up, and then once that turbo kicks in, it really goes. And so it's unevenly distributed depending on how well your group or culture is doing. And so primogeniture is like that. And so it's very interesting in the Bible that for the most part, throughout the cultures of the Bible, primogeniture was practiced. But if you read in the book of Genesis, there's this subtle undermining of primogeniture, and polygamy was commonly practiced in Israel, and continues to be practiced in Islam, partially by virtue of, religions are also on this curve in terms of how adaptable is it versus how determined is it. And now you want to get that formulation right, and that formulation is always going back and forth. You want it slow enough that you're not, again, one of the best things, I've really got to find that again. I found it again recently, because if you change too much, you have a problem. But if you don't change enough, you have a problem. So it's always a matter of trying to get the conservative and the progressive balance right in your culture, because you need to change enough in order to deal with the contextual changes, but you don't want to change too much, because all the early adopters are in some ways, they're all the experiments around there. They're all the guinea pigs, and you watch enough of them die, and you get a little bit more conservative. Of course, this then becomes wisdom, gets encoded in your morality. You should do this, you shouldn't do this. Sexual behaviors, and why is it the fact that religions keep talking about sex and food? Well, sex and food are really basic in terms of the genetic and the epigenetic layers for us. And this was true long before we had any knowledge of genetics or epigenetics. But sex and food are really important. What you eat and the sex life of the community. And religious moral systems really watch those sexual mores, because again, the sexual aspect is where the culture net continues to really churn and change the genetic track. And so that's part of the reason why religious systems are always looking at sex, and the most successful religious systems are really looking very carefully at sex. And so you tinker with the family at your peril. And again, it's really interesting where Brett can, in some ways be uber progressive and all of this stuff, but, Donald Trump has a sex life like an ancient Near East potentate. He's just kind of following an evolutionary genetic track where he's, trying to plant his seed, even if he's trying not to plant his seed, and the hottest women available and as many as possible. Why did Donald Trump have beauty contests? You don't need someone who knows as much evolutionary biology as Brett Weinstein to understand why Donald Trump got into the beauty contest business, okay, Mr. Freud? I mean, there's stuff going on beneath the system. Barack Obama was a virtual Puritan, faithful to his one life, good father to his daughters. Look at Brett and Heather. Long-term marriage, faithful to each other, interested in their sons. They're working a very conservative moral system. And Brett and Heather holding each other accountable and keeping themselves locked into this. And, they only, I don't know how many sons they have. I think they only have sons, and I think they have 2 sons or something like that. I know one of the sons is always helping them with their videos. But, so, hey, I had 5 children. I'm evolution. I'm acting as if I'm more of an evolutionary biologist than Brett Weinstein. But at the same time, you got to struggle to feed all those 5 kids and put them through college, and they ain't cheap. So, and one of the complaints about pastors is they always have too many children. Pastors often have a lot of, at least in the Protestant church. Anyway, so context changes, and so there's always this recalibration within the moral systems. And of course, when it comes to sex, one of the huge changes is the pill. Now we have pervasive, common childbearing has become a conscious choice, and there's less accident in it. And that really changes things. And Peterson is dead on right about that. And there's even questions about, and in fact, Heather Hine got this question about, to what degree does the hormonal, pumping those hormones in to women for birth control? Well, the hormone levels are smaller, but I mean, and Brett and Heather understand these. You're asking us to do math we can't do. Well, why can't we do it? Because we're only seeing this tiny little thing. And when Jordan Peterson says we've only had the pill a very little time, we have no idea what great social experiment we're doing here. And the same goes for same-sex marriage. And now, I've seen numbers that Generation Z, a quarter of Generation Z, especially the women, are gender non-conforming. Well, is it the estrogen in the plastics that is doing this? Is it because I had a friend who was an environmental engineer, and he was studying an invasive snail species here in Northern California. Ben, if you're listening, I'm talking about you. He went to my church, he played the guitar, and I was very sad that he decided to go off and teach college someplace. But I'll not out him. But he's talking about how, put little organisms in a plastic water bottle and the plastic leaches. Well, how is this monkeying with us? We have no idea. But morality is in there because, we have all these, basically every time you go into Costco and you see organic or all natural or your keto diet or your caveman diet or all of this stuff, that's conservatism. We're trying to slow down the changes. Other ways, we're trying to speed up the changes. And so even if we're not paying attention that all of this is religious. This is all happening around us. And so Jordan Peterson says, okay, well, what are archetypes? Archetypes are drama encoded, into representations. And then they get into the mimetic channels, and they get repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated. And so Harry Potter is like Star Wars is like, and then we look at all the different nuances and such. And the realization is, and Peterson says, now this realization that Brett is making here, that's already encoded into religions. This isn't a new idea. Religions have been adopting and accommodating all along. And that was my point about read very carefully the laws in Exodus and read them very carefully in Deuteronomy. And you begin to notice, hey, wait a minute. There's change here. And then read the Ten Commandments and read the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said of old this, but I say to you. What's Jesus doing? Jesus is calibrating. He's modulating the ancient text, and he's updating it. And of course, depending on when you, actually these texts go very long back. Let's say the Davidic period or the exilic period. I mean, these texts, even as they put the texts together, biblical scholars today look at the layers within the text, and you can see layers within the text, and you can see they're always modulating, and biblical scholars note that the text is talking to each other. And you look at Jordan Peterson's big rainbow hyperlink thing about the Bible, that these conversations are always going, and Brett's like, hey, the context might have changed. And Jordan's like, yeah, they thought about that like 3,000-4,000 years ago. They weren't dumb. They knew that, but they're always trying to get achieve, preserve, adapt. They're trying to always trying to get those formulations right, because we need to. Now, one of the things that he says in his video number 50, I know I haven't done the commentary video on that yet. I've just had too many other ideas I wanted to get out. Christianity is in the phylogenetic tree of Judaism. Oh, he used a biology word. I haven't had a biology class since I was in high school, in a Christian school, so we didn't learn evolution. I had to pick that stuff up later. So Christianity is in the phylogenetic tree of Judaism, and Judaism has basically been mimetically impacted by Christianity. And someone made a comment, I almost did a spit take when I heard Brett say that. It's a really key observation. Well, so then I had to look up the phylogenetic tree, and I had to do a little digging and a little self-educating. And, Andrea with the bangs, her superpower is not particular. Oh, I know what the phylogenetic tree. I don't know what it is. I better look it up, and I better learn it. That's how to be a lifelong learner, is to admit to what you don't know. It's how to be a lifelong learner. It's a little bit of wisdom for you. It's one of Jordan Peterson's rules. Act as if the guy that's talking to you might know something that you don't. Why is that a really smart rule? Because you can learn from him or her or them. A phylogenetic tree is a diagram that represents evolutionary relationships amongst organisms. See, he adapted it culturally in that little illustration. Phylogenetic trees are hypotheses, not definitive facts. The pattern of branching in a phylogenetic tree reflects how species or other groups evolved from a series of common ancestors. Now, again, this stuff gets really hard because there's a relevance realization aspect to these systems. And of course, as now we have access to genetics and genetic decoding, our science is getting better and better and better in this. But Christianity is a branch of Judaism. That's exactly right. Because if you get into the Second Temple period, especially the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, Rabbinic Judaism branches from Christianity. But you have someone like the Apostle Paul, and if you're on the Bridges of Meaning Discord servers, you all know Jacob. Jacob doesn't like the Apostle Paul. See, he wasn't a very good Pharisee. Well, it's because Jacob is a really good Pharisee. And at least according, if you trust anything, let's say from the book of Acts, some Pharisees went to Team Jesus and some Pharisees didn't. And if you read the book of Acts, some people liked Paul and some people wanted to kill him. So how good of a Pharisee was Paul? Well, good enough to convince a whole bunch of Gentiles and God-fearers, as they would call, to go on with Team Paul and Team Jesus and not the other team. So and then Christianity gets then into the Roman culture and just, it actually just kind of spreads slowly until you get to Constantine, and then Constantine changes it again, and it continues to adapt, and Christianity just keeps adapting. But the superpower of Judaism is stay. But it's always adapting, and this is, again, why number 50 with Brett and Heather talking about Judaism and some of Brett's ideas about the culture and the practices, and he's bumping then up into God number 2. That's why that video is so interesting. And that's why all bunch of you were like, Paul, you got to watch that video. He's poking at what you've been taking a stick to. Yeah, that's right, he is. And so, but if you look at this and you understand this and understand what Brett has been seeing is that, evolution happens in culture as well. And this is Yuval Harari makes the same point. In the culture net level, it goes much faster than in the other level. Now, if you go back to my conversations with Adam Friended always wants to talk to me about Brett Weinstein's metaphorical truth, evolution, yada, yada, yada. And so Brett's always looking for objective morality. Now, Brett's trying to stay within the modernist frame, as most of the people resisting wokeness are in some ways their own conservatives. And my friend Joey on the Discord server makes the argument that a lot of the woke people have their own kind of conservatism too, because they're trying to preserve the Marxism of the 60s and 70s and bring it into today. So they're their own kinds of conservatives. There's actually lots of different conservatives, but the modernists are saying we need objective morality. Well, what do you mean by objective? Objective like gravity? Objective? Well, the problem is that morality is in the culture verse. So you're not going to find it like, I've got my cell phone you're not going to find it like you find the lens cap. Okay? It's not objective in that way, but it's up in the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary. That's where it's located. That's where morality is located. But again, it's all coming into our behavior. So we can see morality because physical beings act it out, but this of course highlights the bias, the really defeating bias of the materialist system to only track what can be put under a microscope, when really what's governing and what's dominating and what's most real amongst us is stuff going on in the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary, which is governing all of this stuff, which takes this tiny little cheap, let's see if it'll focus. This tiny little cheap lens cap, and has these little springs, and we figured out how to make these little lens caps. They make them cheap. It's freaking amazing. And we're awash in it. That's all the power of the speed of the culture net to colonize and dominate the physical world. And that's why all of that is in some ways more real than this stuff. I don't want to break it because I still use this lens cap, but I can break it. I can do all kinds of things. That's why that which is most real endures. That which is most real colonizes. What colonizes is most real because it determines. And long ago, and Peterson is dead on right with this, long ago, the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary colonized the physical world, and the scientific revolution and all of that has just been speeding it up. But that's what's colonizing, and it colonizes us, and that's why we have a meaning crisis. I feel myself colonized. So Adam's looking for objective morality and sees civilizations in moral competition working through the things of the big picture, and that's why where Adam lays out his argument that, if the Nazis weren't, didn't have the symbolic, dramatic, liturgical, imaginary they had, maybe they would have won the war. And when you look at the history of the Second World War, it was really touch and go often, but certain elements eventually defeated them. Just like if David's corruption had been allowed to continue, it would have destroyed Israel. Now that's all encoded in this story with a prophet and a God, and you'd better do this and you better do not. And the baby gets sick and the baby dies, and it's all interpreted as, this is God's judgment against you, David, and that baby is dying for the sake of the nation, because if you keep up this corruption, you are going to be like all of the other ancient Near East potentates, and that corruption undoes them again and again because those kings rise and fall because they're corrupt, and there's no deep loyalty in their servants beneath them because they know, ask Donald Trump this, what kind of loyalty, he wants loyalty, but hey, guess what, Donald? Loyal is as loyal does. And if you're not loyal to the people beneath you, they'll not be loyal to you. And so, this is a deep theme of wisdom within that story of David and Bathsheba. Now, again, you listen to Christians, it's all, don't have adultery. Yeah, don't do adultery. Adultery destroys the moral fabric of the community. And so over time, it's going to take your civilization down. That's why you have all these moral systems. And that's why I would assert evolutionarily, people who have full-blown, fully realized, fully engaged, both hemisphere, engaged in religion, those societies win. Sun Tzu was right. Wars are won in the temple, not in the battlefield. We say, oh, but that's all of this. Well, once you see the connections, well, I have to really believe in an afterlife and a God. Well, it's gonna colonize more of your brain, and you're actually going to be able to marshal more steadily all of your life if you do. You'll outcompete your neighbor. It's why religious people, secular people have fewer babies. Religious people have more babies. Why? They inherit the future. The religious keep inheriting the future. That's probably why religion is still here. And you can look at that scientifically, and then if your science helps you to see that but also undermines your religion, you sort of have a problem. But then you have the question, what is you? Well, you're a pattern. You're a narrative. You're a story. That's what you are. So Adam's looking for objective morality, and the Nazis and communists lost because they had bad ideas and their cultures lost in the competition. Yeah. They were phylogenetic dead ends. Now, Adam is a big fan of Jonathan Haidt. I often said Haidt. Jonathan Haidt, we'll say it that way, because if I say Jonathan Haidt, then everybody thinks it's bad, and you have all these funny things within language. So Jonathan Haidt's moral foundation theory says, we have all these little moral foundations that are built into us. Okay. With Jordan Peterson, the genetic stream and the culture stream are intermingled. And they play out in civilization. In other words, if someone is very high status because they do care harm, they do fairness cheating, they do loyalty betrayal, they do authority subversion, they do liberty oppression, they do sanctity degradation. And of course, Jonathan Haidt's book that really annoyed his fellow secular atheist liberals, he says, well, guess what? The progressives are really, for the most part, working care harm and fairness cheating. But as it gets increasingly distilled into this woke religion, now it's authority subversion. Now it's loyalty betrayal. Now it's liberty oppression. Now it's sanctity purification degradation. In other words, as it develops into a more fully realized religion, the adaptation continues, so it starts filling out the moral taste buds card as it goes. That's why conservatives have their card filled out, because ideologies are crippled religions, Jordan Peterson says. Well, here it all is. Conservatives are more balanced because their systems are older. And so, Brett Weinstein and Barack Obama might be, really progressive in terms of the chattering rider, but they're elephant, which is determining whether or not they're saying no to, other hotties who come along. And Obama girl, you would imagine if Obama wanted to chase tail, he's super high status. The tail he could chase. Michelle? What would Michelle do to Barack if he starts chasing tail? She won't even let him smoke cigarettes. Notice what we're doing here. And then if you have this worked out in communities, now again, this is always difficult. All these moral systems are aspirational, especially when they push against kind of other older systems such as, do like Donald and spread your seed around. Or do like Barack and keep close with the family. Well, maybe if lots of people in this family are keeping close, and this is where Enforced monogamy comes in. This group will outcompete that group where the men are running around doing as they please. It's how it works out. This is morality, right? And the morality gets encoded, and it gets encoded into mythology, and on and on and on and on. It's all there. So the Nazis built on basically social Darwinism that was very popular in the end of the 19th century. And, these things, there's always a lag effect in this. And again, if you read much in the 1930s, you read eugenic stuff all over the place. And then when we saw it acted out in real life, everybody shrunk back, at least in the West. Well, built on social Darwinism with a low-resolution understanding of genetics. So the Germans are a genetically superior people, and they're not that genetically distinct from just about everybody else in Europe or Africa and Asia. And so you have the competition of the races, and the races will build civilizations. I did a few videos a while ago on Hitler's religion and Timothy Snyder's Black Earth. The races will build civilizations, and because I wondered why on earth are they, why always the thing with the Jews, and Brett and Heather get into that in the video. Why always the thing with the Jews, and again for me it's weird because it wasn't until 5 years ago, no, it was more like 10 years ago now, that we had whispers of it in the family. But oh yeah, my father's line was Jewish. Well, it wasn't good to be Jewish, so, hang with the Dutch Calvinists. So the genetic track has a lot of Jew in it. The culture track went Dutch Calvinist. Well, the Jews keep getting in the way of the pure, material, genetic, racial, organic layer because they keep engaging the culture layer. They keep winning Nobel Prizes. They keep being successful up here. You got to stop all that because that's destroying the world. The Nazis, and I wasn't turned on to this until Tom Holland said in the Delling Pod, the Nazis were greenies. What do you mean the Nazis were greenies? The Nazis were greenies. The Nazis were very environmental. In fact, they were philosophically committed to the environment at a level that most environmentalists who are deep-seated humanists wouldn't dare to be. Humanity needs to go back into our native self. We need to get rid of the state. They understood what Yuval Harari saw about the state. We need to get rid of the state. We need to get states out of the way so the Germanic superiority can flourish. Now, of course, it was a load of BS, but that's what they were working. And that's basic racism. And it's a dumb thing. Doesn't hold water. Now, Marx comes along, and there's this excellent article not long ago about, why Marxism keeps eating the Enlightenment. Well, part of it is the homie idea that the distributists just put out on his Atheism is Really Boring video, which I thought was excellent. More sophisticated theory of social evolution. So at least the Marxists are dealing with social evolution, not genetic evolution, where the Nazis were. Khrushchev, of course, very famous. We will bury you. Well, Khrushchev and the Soviet Union are long buried. You have go big state. I was with my kids last night, and we were talking about Beetlejuice because my kids were looking for Halloween movies, and they mentioned Beetlejuice. I said, "Oh yeah, I remember Beetlejuice. I remember. I watched that. When did Beetlejuice come out? It was like 1989. Oh yeah, I watched that when it came out." And then I was thinking, my kids were born in the 90s. The 80s for my kids are like the 50s for me. And my daughter's like, yeah, you remember the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. You're really old. And it was like, communism, Soviet Union, all of that is lost to my kids. They don't understand. They didn't grow up watching our Western propaganda of the empty Soviet shelves. All of these Soviet ideas sound like a wonderful idea. Might not work in practice so good. And quite frankly, you have way too much capitalism in you. Look at China. And China is just an example that there are other deeper things underneath the surface that made communism evolve as it did in China. Okay, so the idea with Marx is you go really big with the state, and then the state will pass away. Yeah, right. And then morality justifies egg breaking because you're seeking the omelet. And of course, as Orwell said, "Show me the omelet." Well, they're not showing the omelet. They don't have an omelet to show. Well, but that was Marx, and you see, it's evolving at this layer, at the culture layer up there. And again, it's all morality is entwined in all of this. We as a civilization must outcompete and bury the capitalists. Yeah, I hear Kanye make critical noises about capitalism. Tell me more, Kanye. Really? You're not down with capitalism after you've been bragging about the deals that you made, and the first word on your wife's Twitter profile is shop? Oh, baby, you're way into you're way into capitalism really deep, and you're knocking on the door of Calvinism with that pastor you're hanging with. Anyway, you have the history problem. Here's the problem with well-being. You have the history problem with using well-being to navigate. Most of us are navigating this tiny, tiny little, our lives are these tiny little increments. And then our consciousness is this living in the now, this little tiny little thing. And we have memories and some memories of pains and achievements and pleasures. And we're always doing all this little dead reckoning in here. And we establish these moralities, and we tinker with the moral law, and that, well, it's mostly wrong to cheat on your spouse unless they're your soulmate. Well-being is always a judgment made in the midst of time, most often in the now, most often filled with glands and all kinds of things, which is why young people struggle with morality in the way that older folks the glands aren't pumping out the testosterone like they used to, baby. What happened to my hair? Well-being is always a judgment made in the midst of time, and you have the individual problem. Well, right for me, but not right for you. And you have the societal problem. Our society is on the right side of history, so let's decry colonialism and lean into Africa and make them adopt all of our sexual norms. Oh, well, I thought in the 18th and 19th century, when we imposed our sexual norms on those countries, that was colonialism. Yeah, we're really bad at this stuff, because we really live in the now. And for American culture, which is especially amnesic, we're really bad at history, and we're really bad at paying attention. And so this all becomes, the standpoint epistemology. The problem of standpoint epistemology gets huge when you decide that well-being is your navigator. And just listen to Nassim Taleb again. This guy studies much bigger pictures, and so he brings out the Lindy effect. Well, what is the Lindy effect? If you want to get beyond yourself and your time, you need to adopt a very long view of the world. Where could I find this very long view of the world? Well, you can read history, and I'd certainly recommend that you read history, but let me tell you about historians. Historians are always doing when the historians write history, they're doing what I'm doing with my videos right now. I'm trying to appropriate some of the shreds of the past to make sense of my present day and to try to locate me in a longer line. Well, history is nothing compared to religion, because history is sort of an academic exercise, but religion is, again, full-brained. It's both lobes. It's intuitive. It's the right brain. It's the left brain. It's relational. It's sociological. It has to do with your heart. Religion is employing all the stuff that you have and employing it in a community. What a religious community is a phalanx. You hold the line. You have all these pressures to, they can be corrupting. They can be employed that way, but you hold the line. Don't change. Don't change too quickly. And now, of course, when you're in a situation of rapid change, perhaps that's the best way to understand Protestantism, because what Protestantism afforded was an ability for religions as institutions to modulate on the fly. And so if you listen to Bishop Barron say, we have a name for them, Protestants. Well, and so if it's built into your hierarchy as the Roman Catholic Church, well, That's a tremendous advantage because we're not changing. If you look at the Orthodox, we're really not changing. But the Protestants, like, we're changing every day. We're going to start a new church. We're going to start a new denomination. I'm going to start a new religion just with me. I mean, and Protestants change too fast. Others don't change enough, or they're not honest about their change. And so it's all this modulation. And so then when you go into the Roman Catholic Church and they're, look at Jonathan Peugeot's journey about how he became an icon carver. You go back to my first conversation with Jonathan Peugeot. He basically walks through it. He sees the change in art and says, "No, I'm gonna go back and do the old things." Yeah, but he's watching movies. He's doing all that stuff. So, I mean, this is the paradigm. This is the work we must do as we travel through time, and as change keeps lowering this mic, and it keeps bothering me. And I know Rick doesn't like to see it in the picture. Is that bothering you, Rick? Is it bothering you? Anyway. Religion is the oldest, broadest repository of archiving and evaluating these systems and living them out and trying them today. And so that's what you have in religious communities. So you have people who are sort of breaking with the system. We're affirming same-sex marriage, and people like, we're against same-sex marriage. We think we're not going to police sex in church. Really? I don't believe it. Because again, sex is right there with the other evolutionary stuff. You're going to want to keep a real eye on the sex thing. Because sex is like one of the chief doorways in which the culture net gets into the genetic system. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe Brett Weinstein's right, and we're shrieking towards the end of history, but not in a good way. Well, and Christians say, well, what's at the end of history? It's apocalyptic. See, that's built into the system. See, and that's why Ecclesiastes, Kanye West as Kohelet in Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun. Kanye's just, it's a kaleidoscope and a blender. So religion is about the best tool you have around, and religious communities are about the best things you have around. So get into one and start playing the game. Don't just do it virtually by watching it on YouTube. Christianity gets the genetic, cultural, phylogenetic question right. The ethne, which is Greek for the nations, the ethne is the wrong level of relevance realization for your moral landscape. Human beings, genetically, long before we discovered genetics, Jesus looks around and says, guess what? Understand people as a group, as a thing. Make that your group, not your ethne, your little Jewish tribe or your Greek tribe or your whatever little tribe you got going there. People is the tribe. That idea has taken a long time to work through. But within the people tribe, we're all competing. The people as the Navajo called them. You go back through history, and we Greeks are Greek and everyone else is a barbarian. We Romans are Romans and everyone else is a barbarian. We Jews are Jews and everyone else is a Gentile. Now, okay, that sort of works, but you're not paying attention that you're really working in the cultural layer. And that's why, that's how these systems work. So the ethne is the wrong level of relevance realization for your moral landscape. The culture net religion W is the proper layer. And so that's where ritual and everything really becomes important, and moral norms. That's where your morality is really getting into the underside, and sacrifice, as Peterson notes. Civilization is at the layer of competition. These are these long narratives. Now, civilizations are so massive that you need something really deeply encoded like religion to sort of get at the civilization layer. And Jordan Peterson's argument is that the West is the most successful civilization. Hence, it lends credibility to the religious foundation. That's Jordan Peterson in a nutshell, right there. That's his argument. And versions, sort of demythologized, low-resolution versions of that are picked up by various culture warriors like like Dave Rubin and Dennis Prager. And, it's just fascinating to watch Brett and Heather go there. That's just fascinating. And in a sense, that's the story of the IDW right there. But this is also very much in line with Christianity itself, because as Rene Girard really nicely laid out, Christianity is built on self-critique, and this comes from the Hebrew prophets. And Jordan Peterson lays this out in the biblical series, because, usually what happens with the polytheists is that, the gods of Nineveh are eating the gods of the northern kingdom of Israel, and so the king of the northern kingdom does a copy of the shrine in the temple at Nineveh and puts it in the temple of Samaria. You might say, well, that's not a biblical story I've paid attention to. It's in there. Look it up. Why did he copy the shrine of the king of Nineveh? They don't have stealing technology so much in Civilization 6, but in Civilization 4 said stealing technology was a big thing. They're stealing the gods of Nineveh. That's what they're doing. They're trying to, and so then they assimilate into Nineveh. And what they didn't realize is that they were basically giving up the assimilation-resistant monotheism that eventually won. And if you had said that to King Ahab in Samaria, stick with the monotheism. That's going to win long term. No, but polytheism is really good for my well-being. Don't copy that. Don't copy that shrine from Nineveh or Damascus too quickly. Well-being is really hard to know if you're dealing in the now. It's Homer with his mayonnaise jar and vodka. That's for tomorrow Homer to worry about. The founders of the Hebrew prophets, their temple gets destroyed, and they say, what have we done? And now modernists will say, oh, don't blame yourself. That's Babylon's fault. They're the oppressors. Israel says, what have we done? What have we done that was wrong? Well, you worshipped foreign gods, so you gave up, you succumbed to polytheism, and you succumbed to corruption and injustice. Read the book of Chronicles. It's basically the argument of the book of Chronicles. This is perpetually a costly improvement, but it's a really important improvement because it builds into the society. Okay, we're having a pandemic. Well, it's Trump's fault that the pandemic is bad. And, well, maybe we'll get to see Biden try to navigate the pandemic. I don't know that Biden will do a whole lot better than Trump. And actually, there's way too many variables that we're not going to get a clear answer from it anytime soon. And so the two political parties are going to keep fighting. But that perpetual self-critique is a really smart long-term strategy, but really hard short-term. Sort of like Barack Obama's mating strategy of staying faithful to Michelle and Brett and Heather's mating strategy about staying faithful to each other instead of once you get to high status, hey, you're a porn star, let me take you for a spin. That's a bad mating strategy. Well, we've got Stormy Daniels isn't going to conceive and bear a little Trump, so that's how the pill factors into this. And it looks bad in terms of these other moral landscapes, so let's pay her some hush money. But part of Donald Trump's genius is he says I am he and Charles Barkley, except Donald Trump never says this. I am not a role model. I think Donald Trump thinks he is a role model. Donald Trump is not a moral role model. Newsflash. And so a bunch of the evangelical never Trumpers, they just look at this and say, hey, fair is fair. We can self-critique ourselves back in the Bill Clinton days and continue to see the moral problems of Trump. But morality is swimming in a very big system. And so lots of people who would never cheat on their wife will vote for Donald Trump, and others will call them on it. And so that's part of the reason we have this perpetual food fight in the West about these things. And if we can tolerate it, we will actually develop and build on it and make progress, because what we're doing is working this calculation out massively among human populations. So the critics of Christianity use Christian morality to critique it. That's powerful. And if Christians can pause and listen to their atheist critics and say, oh, you got a point. Well, suddenly you're going stronger. You're getting stronger. You're learning. You're listening. And you see this with Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein and the woke. The woke just kind of came up and realized, and now we've got Kendi, and now we've got D'Angelo, and now we've got James Lindsay, and now we've got Neil Shenvi, and now we've got we got Douglas Murray, and we're talking through all of this stuff, and we're working it through, and we haven't changed the whole society. And don't forget, part of American genius is it's hard to change things. So to pass a constitutional amendment, not easy. Why is that important? Well, we passed prohibition. 10 years later, decided it was a bad idea. 30-year run up to prohibition. So figuring out the change, not change thing is really critical. And as Jordan Peterson says, it's best to think about these things and let your ideas die so that the physical layer doesn't, because the physical layer is part of the sticky, long-term, very conservative, very practical pattern that keeps perpetuating the other patterns in the much faster realm of the change in the culture net. So Brett Weinstein's Gnosticism. Evolution is a genocidal spelling bee. Thankfully, it works very slowly. Morality is part of the much faster culture net that is working through. What is the basis for morality when success is the outcome of adaptation? Those kind of judgments require long, long periods of time. And so, again, because Sam is such an expert in a lot of these ancient thoughts, he watches Brett Weinstein and says, it sounds kind of Gnostic. Don't know if I can quite put that together, but this is what I think. And he says it to me, and I say, yeah, that sounds Gnostic too, because I know some of that stuff like you know, Sam, and you and I have been talking, and so the ideas go back and forth, and so his idea colonizes me, and my idea colonizes him, and we colonize each other, and we go back and forth, and we try living things out, and on and on and on and on and on and on, and it's like, yeah, Sam, Brett Weinstein's got he's got a little strain of Gnosticism going on in him. Does he think that the world was created by a lesser being, and that now morality is somehow grounded? Where are you finding your morality, Sam? Brett? Brett has no standpoint outside of the system to critique the system. That's a real problem. That's part of the problem Jordan Peterson's been pointing out. He says, well, Christianity said that every instantiation of the king, as did Judaism, every instantiation of the king is accountable to, now again, Jordan Peterson's from below, accountable to the greatest king imaginable, the ontological argument. Was that king real? Well, if you say he isn't real, a good amount of the mental, social machinery that really determines how you live is not going to be operating. And that's why people say they're atheists, and Jordan Peterson's like, I'm really a little skeptical. Because all that stuff is built into you, and it's built into you so deeply, you're not really going to be an atheist quite so easily. And we hear that say, Susan Blackmore, I'm offended. Okay. Be offended. So you act like all of this stuff is real. You act like there's meaning and purpose. You act like this is important. In fact, all of the mental, emotional, cognitive, social machinery is putting you into that system. So, I'm an atheist. Oh, yeah, right. That's the chattering rider on top of the elephant. The elephant is acting like a very religious being because the elephant wants to live, and the elephant knows that rider doesn't weigh so much. The elephant knows. In theism, the standpoint is the God who is outside the system. Okay? So God number one, God number two. The system is authored by the God, but the God is not dependent on the system. Okay? God is not identical to the system. That's where pantheism breaks down. Okay? The God is outside the system. And Tolkien is outside the Lord of the Rings, but the Lord of the Rings is utterly dependent upon Tolkien. Again, it's a book analogy. It breaks down in some ways, but it gets at, that's what analogies do. They get at this, they don't cover that. That's the beauty of analogies. It's the beauty of metaphors. So it plays out in the broadest possible population because it employs all the developed human relational narrative faculties to do the processing. It's sort of like in most of your computers, you have a CPU and a GPU. Now, if you bought just this Intel chip, you've got the integrated GPU, which my friend Rick says is mostly just software. And Rick used to work for Intel, so maybe Rick is right. I don't know. But so then when I buy a piece of hardware that I'm going to do a lot of video processing or gaming on, I make sure it's got a NVIDIA or an AMD GPU on it. It's got hardware. And so basically what atheists sort of do is they say, we're just going to go along on the CPU. It's like, oh, baby, that religious GPU, that sucker has horsepower. Why? Well, look at how religion is all over the ancient wars and the sacrifices and the temples and yeah, because it's the GPU. It's because we get fully engaged because we engage each other, and the woke kind of got into that, but long term, I don't think they're going anywhere. And again, Jonathan Peugeot is dead on right. You're not going to build a civilization on a reactive parasitic thing. It can't stand. So it's not going to go that far. Well, it might cause a whole bunch of suffering in the end of important nations or civilizations. Yeah, but the deeper things continue to endure and come back up. Look at what's happened in Russia and the Soviet Union. The corruption is harder to get out, but yeah, you want the CPU and the GPU engaged, God number one and God number two. Both hemispheric systems. You want it all online, and so that's why Brett and Heather they live like religious and say, no, we're not religious. Okay, you just keep being faithful to each other and keep raising up those sons to be moral, and you just keep working that Western system and say, we're not working the Western system. Okay, just keep saying that. I don't care what you say. I watch what you do. And there we have it. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. This is part of the reason atheists will always be a minority. It's underpowered. You can't get that far with it. They're a functional minority, and they have their place in the conversation, and I think that's really helpful to understand the anti-corruption necessity of the Protestant Reformation, the anti-corruption necessity of the Enlightenment, the Jesus smuggling. I think in the best understanding of Eric Weinstein's term, you have to get that out of the system because it's actually a corrupting element, and you want things to really function. You want to keep purifying your systems. So they're a functional minority, but will never be a larger player in the culture net religion W. They just won't, because they're really good on the CPU, but boy, I'll tell you, if you're playing a first-person shooter, you need to have that GPU in there. It's just the way it is. They ignore too much of our really powerful individual and communal processing power, and they turn a blind eye to the greatest repository of understanding what is right and wrong and what works in the world. That's why atheists, they're sort of like geldings. They can't produce. And we're already moving beyond secularity. And that's what I got into deconstructing the naive faith of the Enlightenment. Living as if there is no God, that's secularity. And Jordan Peterson basically comes in and says, God, you're always going to have one. You might as well engage in the full system. Well, he doesn't actually go that far. He goes right to the edge, as Rationality Rules notes. He and destiny. Destiny. That's the atheist name you choose? Destiny? Really? Was it destiny? I don't know. I might have it wrong. I got lots of stuff wrong. India is rebuilding temples. Turkey is rededicating the Hagia Sophia. When the rest of the world comes online, Europe, are we going to be a Muslim continent? Where's that going to go? The world explored the secular, exhausted it, and is bringing older, broader parts of the code back online. But again, you don't want to lose what this gave us. It's back to Daniel Vonnegut. You have to see out of both eyes. That's really hard. Pattern seeing patterns. Trying to figure out how that works. The helpful enlightenment coding is increasingly assimilated. And so these conversations between someone like James Lindsay and the woke and working that through, and Neil Shenvi, who is arguing a very modernistic branch of Christianity, still lots of gas in that engine, but that's what they're doing. They're working with the assimilation. Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay are far more postmodern than just these facile labels allow. Because once you can take a step back and no longer see modernity through naive eyes, you're already to a degree postmodern. You're already above the system, sort of. You're already looking at it. And that's where we're at right now and what we're doing. And the same thing is happening in the church. But of course, the church has so much more legacy code to work through, and so many communities that are actually trying to live out their legacy code. And so it's sort of like imagining a server farm, and like one or two of those servers is sort of buzzing with the atheism plus code and working that through. But all the rest of the server farm of the 8 billion people fully with religion and culture and all of that with that's all buzzing with the rest of it. And now it's going between servers and it's working out in there, but that's what's happening, because it's not just the thoughts that I have in my head, it's what I live out in my life. And then again, why Barack Obama is look at Donald Trump and Barack Obama in terms of their mating practices. You're looking at two different systems. Look at Brett Weinstein and Milo Yiannopoulos. Milo Yiannopoulos, well, there's some interesting stuff. We had a little watch party on the Discord server yesterday watching Joe Rogan and Alex Jones. And, Peugeot, if you're not watching Peugeot, you're missing out, because, and Peugeot isn't terribly easy to understand sometimes. But Peugeot knows enough about patterns that he can watch Kanye and watch Alex Jones and say, there's something shamanistic going on there. Now, you might not want them running your country, but, it's sort of like, we have a lot of mockingbirds over by my house, and in the summer I'll sit outside and you'll just hear the mockingbird go through, where's that mockingbird getting? That mockingbird is getting all of the other songs from all the other birds. So if you want to know what are the other birds in the neighborhood, you can go out and find all the other birds, or you can listen to the mockingbird. You can hear what he has to say. And of course, human beings are far more complex than that, but in some ways, Kanye and Alex Jones are mockingbirds. And Joe Rogan's able to pull the thread out from them. Here's the thing. It's always hard to navigate within your little bubble. That's why you read history. That's why religion is so enormously helpful, especially some of the bigger, broader religions, because, Roman Catholicism, part of the advantage they have is they have a worldwide net. And so, and even the Methodists, when they were having the big fight about same-sex marriage, well, on one hand, all of the woke Methodists are like, we have to listen to people of color, and all of the people of color out of Africa says, yeah, no to same-sex marriage. It's like, well, you're doing the processing. We will bury you, Khrushchev says. Oh, no. Acknowledge the Lindy effect. We've now reached the border of the secular experiment and are venturing forward. Christianity brought progressivism onto the main line in the world. If past transitions are any indication, this will be painful, messy, and bloody. It's just true. These are very long processes. Take centuries and decades. Now, things are speeding up, but the world is very big. And so, what Kanye was saying to Joe Rogan, we say, well, 1.5 billion people are online? How many of those people are on Twitter? 200-300 million? How many of those Twitter accounts on Twitter are actually active? Tens of thousands. How many of those tens of thousands do you actually follow? A few thousand? A few hundred? We're so full of our own self-importance. We're really small. We're coming to the end of the Protestant Reformation Enlightenment phase. We have centuries to go. So how are you going to navigate? How are you going to break out of your bubble? And not just mentally watching YouTube videos. It involves talking to people. It involves changing how you live. It involves getting into a commitment. Well, why is commitment so important? Why is committing to a religious tradition so important? Because you become accountable to that tradition, and that forces you into areas that you wouldn't before. It forces you out of your bubbles. It changes your behavior. And I think right now, because this is the layer that is changing so fast, Tom Holland's I lost my faith in the Enlightenment. He's living into the story, prioritizing the storyverse layer, knowing that in terms of his life, Tom Holland's life, that's the most reasonable layer to proceed. It's absolutely rational, absolutely making sense. And so here you've got this evolutionary biologist who in some ways is saying, well, I know things because I look at evolutionary biology. Yeah, but evolutionary biology is only 100 or so years old. Tom Holland's reading history. That's thousands of years old. He's reading religion. That goes way back. That's why Tom Holland is like Jordan Peterson. More like Jordan Peterson than Brett Weinstein, even though he's sort of associated with the IDW, and I asked Tom Holland about Jordan Peterson, didn't know anything about him. That shows something big in the system is moving, bigger than Jordan Peterson, bigger than Tom Holland, bigger than Brett Weinstein, bigger than the woke. Stuff in the system is moving. That's God-sized stuff. It's moving. How are you going to know? How are you going to pay attention? It isn't to dismiss the other layers, but simply to understand how they play out in the smaller segments, like an individual life. Tom Holland is doing the reasonable thing to do. You're just one little life. And it matters a lot to you. You're like the center of your world in some ways, but it's just one little life. And we're going to be gone, but we're part of this much larger thing. And so, hey, credits to Kanye. He's taking his best shot. He's got a little bit of time. And often, if you're in a situation of chaos, that's what you learn. And I don't think these two are safe from God number 2. Water rolls downhill. Now, maybe they'll just keep God out. C.S. Lewis couldn't. Many people can't. You got to be careful with your reading. Relating to God number 2 brings all the faculties online in ourselves as individuals, families, and communities. It really puts us in the game in a way that just a theoretical talking about God number 1 really doesn't do. Now, you've got to understand God number 1 and the way that proceeds. Otherwise, what happens is God number 2 communities just get very insular and they kind of go off and do their little game, and they're like the Shakers. Find the Shakers today. You can't find the Shakers. Why? They didn't reproduce. So this is why you deal with very long histories and why you become accountable to a religious community. And yeah, it's gonna be all kinds of modulations through that. But that's actually how you contribute to the far, far larger conversation. So thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Hope it was helpful. I should say these things. Subscribe, support, Patreon, link to the church, join the Bridges of Meaning Discord. John Van Donk and I did that conversation about starting estuary groups, and John's not the worst I know in terms of technology. And he said to me, so he was in church on Sunday, so it was on the Freddie and Paul show, and he says to me, I didn't get a single response. I thought, well, maybe we don't know anything. Last night, late, he sends me a text. I just didn't know where to look. I got 17 responses. So John's estuary leadership cadre is off and running, and I'm really interested to see how that goes. Because, again, if you're just watching videos and thinking this stuff in your head, you're not in the game. You want to get in the game? And again, you look at all Jordan Peterson stuff. Make a commitment. Make a commitment to a woman or a man. Start a family. Get a job. Do something. Don't just think something, because this stuff is moving really fast. Live into the story. Make yourself accountable to a group of people. Hopefully people with long-term ties to deep old things. And sort of in a Kanye way, go for broke. Might be bumpy. Kanye's life has been bumpy. Might get locked up, but you're not safe from God number two. That's one aspect of the atheists, that they are dead wrong and continue to be wrong and display their willful blindness, is they think that's going to inherit the earth. No, won't inherit the earth. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll talk to you later. Been putting out a lot of content this week. I know some of you are crying under the load, but if you've been around the channel, you know it comes and goes. So I'm starting to get some conversations stacked up, and I might dual post some of these days, which just makes it worse, but we'll see. So Friday I'll be in the Discord. Hopefully this week we'll talk about some of these things. So if you're interested, get onto the Discord Friday morning, 10 a.m. California time, question and answer in the Discord. I sometimes post some of those recordings here. And thank you for your time and attention.